All right, good day, everyone. It is that time of the week, and doesn't really need an introduction just because the fact that based upon the emails and the chat rooms, everyone was asking when would it be time for another Sirius report with London Paul, and not enough words to say the amount of good work, the amount of knowledge, and I know I personally look forward to it. His weekly show. So, Paul, how are you, sir?
I'm very well, and how are you, CJ?
I'm doing great. I'm surviving. V's on vacation, so I have the honor and privilege of hosting with you today. So I'm very excited, and I know that there is a lot going on, and kind of like we chat a little bit before we went live. I think it's important to pause and also to kind of look back, if you will, to see the previous actions and where we currently are. So let's jump right into it.
Yeah, okay. Well, first off, just a very quick good morning, good afternoon, good evening to everyone's listening, and thanks for all your support and your kind thoughts. And I'm glad we're back. We just had things to deal with last week, which happens. But yeah, I thought it was a good point this week to kind of try and draw a line under a whole bunch of things, so we don't have to keep going back to them. And in a sense, if people do ask questions, we can say, okay, go and listen to the show on the 7th of August as a way of drawing a line, but showing kind of where we are currently in the whole frame of things. But we'll kind of go through. It's quite a long process. It probably will take a whole hour to do this, maybe a bit quicker. We'll see how we go and accordingly. But the basic bottom line with everything, ultimately, it all comes down to the fact that China and Russia understand the concept of what we call sound money, and hence why they've been acquiring huge amounts of gold. They both roughly have about 40,000 tons, despite what everyone says to the contrary. And then in the stark contrast, we have this Western adoption of quantitative easing and zero interest rate policy, which just has expanded the quantity of money. Now, we have to be careful about this because, yes, China's expanded its money supply via bank credit. And there's a lot of speculation in the Western media that China's going to suffer as a consequence of this. And whilst people may disagree, it won't be the case. But there were legitimate reasons for why they did this. Essentially, they were reliant on foreign trade to grow and stimulate their economy. Now, obviously, because they have a significant export market. Now, if you think since 2008, Western economies have been very weak despite all the indications to the contrary from commentators, etc. Now, so to have an adoption of what would be sound money policy would have led to a rapidly declining Chinese economy and the loss of, I would even estimate 50, 60, 70 million jobs. And the Chinese went, we can't do this. So yes, there was an expansion in bank credit, which doesn't exactly correspond to sound money, but they have managed it and have it under control, despite what people think. And we've spoken before on the podcast we do for our subscribers and on the shows that China's rotating their economy, whereby the focus is now very much on the internal economy. So there's going to be significant change in terms of infrastructure, technology, and the goods they produce. And yes, they are also managing the credit bubble in the process. However, China recognized back in before 2008, but certainly post 2008, that as much as doing this, it wasn't sufficient for them to have a thriving export market and changing their internal market. And this is why we saw the rapid birth of the One Belt, One Road and the expansion of the Chinese economic model through Asia and into Europe. And hence why I term the phrase the expansion of the One Belt, One Road from Lisbon in Portugal in the west to Vladivostok in the east. Now, Europe is going to become a major trading partner, unfortunately, largely at the expense of the United States as things stand. Now, we've already seen some of the reasons. Obviously, there's the whole sanctions issue with China and Russia, which isn't being very detrimental to the US. But you're seeing how Europe is beginning to migrate towards China, and Germany and China are starting to build stronger relations. And yeah, unfortunately, it's a combination of the US shooting itself in the head with regards to the sanctions, but also how Europe's starting to grow away from the US. And when I say the US, I mean the capitalists, the deep state, not the United States of the future, whenever that comes to pass. So we have to be careful how we rephrase that. Now, the One Belt, One Road model is kind of self-explanatory, but it's largely lost on many people in the West and still does. I mean, I talk to people frequently who still don't seem to have a clue what it means. Now, what it does is it brings about rapid reindustrialization of Asia, and that includes critical infrastructure. And we've spoken before about all the rail links that are coming into existence and being commissioned. Now, obviously, this is hugely beneficial for China because they can send goods to Europe via rail now in under 10 days, and I expect that'll decrease further and further. And currently it's about 15 to 20 days. But it's a win-win for Europe as well. Let's be clear, it's not all about China, because Europe is in the future is going to be able to export goods and machinery that can be shipped the other way, and the costs are considerably less. And to put this in context, in 2016, there was around, I think, 1,800 freight trains made the journey from Europe to China over thousands of miles. And that was more than double the figure for 2015. And it's anticipated that in 2017, the figure's probably going to double again. Now, 1,800 freight trains equates to more or less 6 a day. So that gives the perspective how huge this growth is. And so that's one important aspect. You have the land aspect of things. Now, we've also got the Maritime Silk Road, and it's not spoken about that much. And I did put an article on our website quite last year, which detailed all these. But the Maritime link's very important as well because it includes nations of the South China Sea, the South Pacific, and the Indian Ocean, and that'll expand into Europe via the Mediterranean. So you have ports such as Gwadar, the deep port in Pakistan, and Mombasa in East Africa are being expanded. It's also why China's now put a military base in Djibouti, and hence also why they're expanding rail links from Mombasa to Nairobi and Kampala, which is in Kenya and Uganda, and it will expand across all of Africa eventually. I mean, this is the early days. Now, we all know Africa's an asset-rich continent that's being raped and pillaged by the West, but as many people probably know, China's been developing assets there for 15 years. Now, a lot of them are now starting to become quite mature because to develop assets and produce mines, etc., takes a long time. They don't happen overnight. It's a long sort of gestation period. So they're now at the process where they can transport via rail to Mombasa for shipment to Asia to enable this reindustrialization of Asia, as we spoke about. So there is a really deep plan involved. This is not kind of just a situation where people are just guessing and throwing ideas about. China's, as we've always said, they always have a plan, and they work on 5-year plans normally. But sometimes they'll have 10-year, 15-year, 20-year plans, which is more expansive. And clearly, the development of Africa is important because Africa needs to be stimulated as a continent, and it needs to be freed from the rape and pillage by Western nations for longer than we care to remember. So that's one kind of important aspect. And is there anything in that? Because I think we'll break this down. I won't, just because I could just talk for a whole hour, which is kind of rather pointless. But is there anything you'd like to chip in with, CJ, or comments or questions on that?
Well, I think it's very important to understand exactly what you mentioned as far as that the world's economies are changing, rather quickly, and unfortunately, it's away from the, I don't even want to say traditional, U.S. Paradigm. It's more based upon outside of the United States and what's happening around us, and more, Paul, it seems like the United States has continued to be isolated regarding this.
Yes, and it's an unfortunate consequence that when you have the world's reserve currency and you become the detonation to the world, at some point in history, it was inevitable, despite many people feeling it would never come to pass, that nations in the East and obviously eventually Europe would turn around and say enough's enough. Europe was always going to come after these. It was always going to be born out of China and Russia. But there's a reality to this because the Eurasian continent was always seen as a major threat to the capitalist hegemony and control. And it's precisely why, as we said before, that the establishment of a Berlin-Moscow-Eurasian axis had to be stopped. Kind of post-World War One, post-World War Two. It's in addition why Japan was made a vassal state of the capitalists after World War Two to prevent integration with China, because the integration of Berlin or Russia and Germany and or Japan and China were key indicators of the cabal. If this comes about, our hegemony, our control of the world is under threat. And we already know that the Berlin, Moscow, Beijing axis is under development. You've got and this is why the US have tried to attack the Nord Stream 2 pipeline. You've got German commerce. You've got China and Russia trade deals, de-dollarization, all the things we've spoken about. We don't need to go into masses of detail in that regard. But we're also seeing, obviously, development via China of the One Belt, One Road to the ports in Eurasia. As we said, the Gwadar port in Pakistan is a great example. It's also does the link between China, Bangladesh, India, Myanmar, which obviously used to be Burma. So these are other key facets, that it's not just where we're taking a land situation and a maritime situation and there's no cohesive plan. Everything's integrated. And then, of course, we've seen the development of the Shanghai Cooperation Organization, a very key aspect that's largely gone under the radar, largely not understood. And obviously, we've had the new membership of India and Pakistan recently, which, historically have been nations that haven't exactly got on particularly well with regard to the Kashmir dispute. Now, the combined population of the Shanghai Cooperation Organization members is about 3 billion people out of a world population of 7 billion. But there's also dialogue partners and observer states, and they're going to join in the fullness of time. And when you add that into the Far Eastern nations who have strong economic ties with China, you're talking roughly 4 billion people out of 7 billion in the world straight off. And this is why how strong it is. And people tend to lose focus and go, well, who cares what really goes on in the Far East, or them, and even extending obviously into Eurasia and eventually the Middle East and Europe. But at this stage, it's a strong organization. Undoubtedly, at some point, and this is Japan and South Korea will join the Shanghai Cooperation Organization. That, I think, is an inevitability. And these, nations under this umbrella who are either in the SCO or these umbrella nations, dialogue partners, Far Eastern nations, they have huge advantages in economic terms because they have low-cost governments, low tax burdens. Whereas, and of course, the ability of these nations can make major improvements to the standards of living, which is far greater than that of nations of Western Europe and North America, as just examples, which have high spending governments with welfare costs spinning out of control and dangerously high. And they also have high savings rate. And as poor people within these nations are lifted out of poverty, and they can become savings driven people as well. And people say, oh, well, that's not going to happen. Well, it's happened because look at China, 500-600 million people lifted out of poverty into a genuine middle class lifestyle, whereas we're seeing the middle class gutted in Western nations. I don't have to look in the UK and the US are two great examples where that's happening. And then we also look a bit further afield towards the Middle East, and you have Iran and Turkey. Now, they're very likely to join the SCO also, possibly as soon as within a year, particularly with regards to Iran. Turkey is going to be more controversial, but we all know the history of Turkey, and we can talk a little bit about that shortly. But these again have countries that populations like to save money, and they have an emphasis on gold. We all know that the Iranians have big gold holdings, that Turkey does too. So the emphasis once again is on the sound money principle of gold. Now, when we kind of look at the Kabbalist designs, it's clear they see obviously Moscow and Beijing part of this Eurasian axis as the greatest threat to their hegemony and rule. And that's why we constantly see this relentless desire to demonize Russia. I mean, that's self-evident in the UK, the US, and the vast majority in parts of Europe and beyond. And also why they try to thwart Chinese economic growth and their presence on the world stage. This is precisely why. And I don't see this as a Trump policy. I see it as a Kabbalist policy to try and thwart Chinese economic growth and expansion, and why they're concerned about the trade deficit and not actually saying, well, what can the US do to improve itself economically? Is it going to learn some lessons in terms of the changes it needs to make to rotate its own economy, to make it a strong, vibrant nation amongst equals on the world stage, which we've said many times before is exactly what the US requires. Now, it's worth mentioning at this point that the capitalists have historically fought wars on three fronts. It's militarily, economically, and financially. Now, if we look, they've tried to fight militarily in the last, well, post kind of 9/11. You've got Syria, Iraq, Afghanistan. Yemen is a proxy war. Whatever anyone says, it's a proxy war between the US and the Iranians. The Saudis, just the cannon fodder, and in the middle of trying to win a war, which is ultimately highly destructive for all the reasons we know to the Yemenis people as well. You've got Ukraine, and they've failed to achieve all their objectives. That is irrefutable. I don't think anyone can argue that whatever they've tried to succeed in doing has failed.
Correct. Correct.
You know, I don't think there's any doubt. They've also lost the economic war because of their insane desire to adopt this long-term strategy of zero interest rate policy in QE. In essence, the exact opposite of what you'd call sound money. Now, this is why, if you look historically, people went, well, this is all part of the cabal plan to destroy all the economies and take everything down, and then they can rebuild with a new centralized one world government control. It absolutely could never be the case, because the one thing they did by adopting this long-term strategy was to preserve the very essence of what they had, to preserve the dollar. That's what it's all about. And if they'd have sank everything at that point, you would have seen the death of the dollar and the death of their empire. All they've done since 2008 and even before that is to struggle to keep this insanity going. And that's precisely where we're at now. So in essence, the only war left to fight now, and has been ongoing even really since 2008, is this financial war. And as we said, that all revolves around the US dollar. Now, Russia and China, as we've stated many times before, chose to avoid direct confrontation and allow the US to shoot itself in the head, foot, torso, arms, and everywhere else. Because China and Russia now see the US dollar and the US economies in terminal decline, bring about a non-US denominated world via the One Belt, One Road, the AIIB, the Asian Infrastructure Investment Bank, the New Development Bank, the NDB, and then you've got the SIPs and MIR, which is the Chinese and the Russian alternatives to SWIFT payment. You've got bilateral trade deals in non-dollar terms, etc. Now, Russia and China don't hide the fact they want to bring an end to the capitalists and their potent weapon of destruction, namely the dollar. That's irrefutable, but they're not going to do it in an aggressive way, because I get a lot of people saying to me, well, why don't they just sink it? And believe it or not, in 2008, I think that there was talk about doing it, and then China and Russia both realized, look, if we do this, we're doomed. We have nothing in place to replace it. We don't have an AIB. We don't have the One Belt, One Road, or all these other mechanisms which are exact alternatives to a US hegemonic or cabal hegemonic world, and that's precisely what they've avoided. So, is there anything? I think maybe take a break at that point. And is there anything you'd like to mention or ask or discuss?
Yes, absolutely. As you were speaking, Paul, and a couple of if it's too early in the conversation, that's fine. But I do want to speak a little bit around the new sanctions that were passed, and in part, how much quicker does that speed up the process in terms of the EU pivoting even more towards Eurasian, towards more the One Belt, One Road initiative?
It's a great question, and it doesn't matter. Let's just chip the questions in. If there's no real order, if we cover ground out of order, it's fine. I'm not bothered. We can move around a little bit. It doesn't detract. It's a great question. Yes, of course, it most certainly does, because the one thing, and it was interesting because in essence, Congress did Trump a great big favor, because they forced his hand to sign sanctions. He had no choice, because I can guarantee if he'd refused and vetoed it, they would have only implemented it anyway, and may have used it as an opportunity in some perverse way to try and launch impeachment proceedings against him. So yes, they forced his hand to sign them. But the great thing in the process is, by forcing his hand to sign them, they have very much brought about more Eurasian integration from Europe, more anger and frustration with the US, more likelihood to de-dollarize, more likelihood to say enough's enough and we're going to take counter sanctions. We haven't seen anything yet of any note. Yes, I know there's the whole thing with Russia and 750 odd diplomats. That's just nothing really. It's just tokenism and just a way to say to the US, we'll make symmetric um, you know, sanctions in inverted commas. If you implement more things, we'll do so. But I think maybe it's a good point to say, as much, and I've covered this off with our people on our podcast, started to dissect some of the stuff with, characters in the United States. The one thing with Tillerson for me is the most important, far more important than Trump at this stage, is Tillerson and what he is capable of achieving on a world stage, because he has a very balanced view. He wants to have stronger relations with China and Russia. He wants an end to the nonsense. He doesn't want US hegemony anymore, and he sees the world changing. But he's very much the kind of lone wolf in terms of his ability to make those changes. Trump's very much stymied still. There is still a lot of infighting inside the White House. I think some recent appointments will make some changes to that, but it's a slow process. There is, in essence, still an internal war going on inside the White House and in the administration to try and wrestle control from the Washington machinery. So Tillerson's hugely important, but I think undoubtedly, yes, the sanctions are. But the thing that can't be leveled at Trump in the future is, you approve these sanctions and look at ultimately economically and politically the damage it's done to the US. In the future, he can turn around to Congress and say, you forced my hand, you have caused this damage to the United States and its people. You have to shoulder responsibility for it. So in that sense, and it's not a clever move on behalf of Trump. He had no choice, but in a way it allows him to wriggle out of being held directly responsible for these actions. But we know ultimately the problem inside the Washington administration and Congress, the Senate, they still have this belief that the US is it's the numero uno nation in the world. It still controls everything, and there are going to be no consequences for the US taking this action without actually realizing in the real world it's very, very different, and the world's changing, and
Correct.
other nations are not going to tolerate it. So no, it's a great question to mention and a very valid point. But I think we've kind of addressed it by hopefully it helps to explain why what Trump's done. It's not a great thing for the US, but ultimately had no choice, that because the consequences of not doing so wouldn't change anything, and it would make his position far less tenable as well. And that is a huge consideration that we have to factor into our thinking, because I think if anything, if Trump was seriously undermined or there was any real attempt to remove him from office, Tillerson's not going to hang around. I don't think Tillerson's very happy, but I think he's absolutely pivotal to the future for the United States, and particularly because of his ability on a world stage to see the bigger picture and understand it. And he's desperately fighting a battle internally to try and convince people, and also to circumvent the Washington machinery. And this is why we hear all these contradictions between him saying very pragmatic, sensible things on the one hand, and on the flip side, you've then got insane policies like let's sanction Russia, which is going to affect their economy. Well, they think it does, it won't, but it's going to damage European economies even more, who are absolutely fed up of sanctions anyway, because they're the big losers. The US doesn't lose anything with these sanctions, because it just carries on doing what it wants to do irrespective, and turns a blind eye to sanctions. And when it wants to do trade deals with the Russians or trade deals with the Iranians, it will do it. It just doesn't broadcast the fact, but it carries on doing it. But it's in a way it's punishing Europe, because it knows full well that Europe's rotating east, and Europe has always been the key battleground. Hence World War One, hence World War Two, and the European Union was a desire to control, to prevent, as we said, the birth of the Eurasian axis between obviously Germany and Russia, and you factor in China into that, and Iran and everything else as it's unfolding, and it's their worst nightmare coming to fruition.
Yeah, thank you for that. And then in terms of the IMF signaling, moving their headquarters to China, and in part, that the fact that the yuan, I think it was over a year ago, was introduced as far as the baskets of currencies, and the yuan gaining even more potential voting power in the IMF. I guess where I'm getting at is that what would that look like in terms of the trading block, not only the AAIB, but in part, would they negotiate in terms of each other's currency? What would keep the manipulation of each country, just basically printing their own currency like the U.S. does? I mean, what does that look like, Paul? Because I think it's important when we say that the entire Eurasian, everything is pivoting towards the east, and it's really changing a lot of things here, U.S., and that's why we see this escalation events with Russia and China, and it's more or less to try to preserve the dollar. What would that change look like? What would it be?
Well, I think first off, the IMF's living in some dream world because, I mean, the SDR, from my perspective, is a basket of basket case currencies. I mean, they're all fiat currencies. It's just their dream that somehow, and if they try and butter up the Chinese, I mean, the idea the IMF's going to move to, I think they said within a decade's farcical. I mean, but they don't, the IMF doesn't realize what's really going on. They still see the world from a US hegemonic perspective, and they kind of go, well, yeah, China's going to crawl in through the back door very soon. They're never really going to challenge the dollar. The dollar's here to stay, and I think it's largely a bit of an illusion. The SDR thing was blown out of proportion completely by certain people who shall remain nameless that I completely disagree with on just about everything. But um, the reality is it's just hot air. It's of no value. I mean, Chinese aren't that interested. They don't really care. Yes, it gives as far as the kind of mainstream political and common economic commentators go, oh, China's got a little bit more of a stake, but it's not going to challenge the US dollar. And it's not going to sucker the Chinese into believing that somehow they're going to adopt the IMF mentality of countless decades. So I don't really see it. And the Chinese, and we'll start to go into this as we talk a bit more in terms of this overview as to why that's all really largely an irrelevance. And as we, I go through the next sort of parts of this discussion, hopefully that will clear it up. But if there's anything that doesn't clear it up, then let's come back to this question and address it in more detail. I think that's probably a good way forward.
Excellent.
Okay, so we said that, the destruction of the dollar. So, and what are the consequences of what we've seen? Well, as we say, NATO's failed in the Middle East via Syria. Latterly, the whole Qatar thing's blown up, and the loss of control and influence principally over Saudi Arabia. That's clear. The West's lost control of it. And the US, as we said, is now at war internally, effectively, between the Trump administration and the military versus the US intelligence agencies. I don't have any doubt that the US intelligence agencies are the ones with the major problem. They're the ones who are sticking their oar in and trying to drive US foreign policy, which is very hugely detrimental to the US in its current state. 20, 30 years ago, maybe pre 2008, it wasn't really an issue. The US could carry on doing this, but now economically and politically and financially, it's a lot weaker. And of course, the process of all this is destabilizing the US and their influence overseas, and critically with allies such as Germany, as we've seen. Germany starting to talk about imposing sanctions on the US. It's rotating towards Russia privately. That's still ongoing, and publicly very much embracing China in the process. But what Trump actually succeeded in doing is destroying the capitalist plan since World War II. They wanted their united Europe via the current EU model, which is highly destructive. NATO designed to subjugate Russia and move NATO closer and closer to Russia's borders in a pre-collapse Soviet era, hence why Romania is part of it. Except, it's just moving those borders closer and trying to hence take Ukraine, putting Ukraine in NATO, so it shoves it right up to the Russian border. And also, believe it or not, the whole purpose was to subjugate Germany. Because they had to. It sounds crazy when people go, well, Germany's the economic powerhouse in Europe, but it's also effectively on the hook. the European Union goes down, Germany crashes and burns for the third time in a major way in 100 years. So
Right.
there are strings attached which are deeply damaging because, as well as we said earlier, the cabalist plans being to control Russia and subjugate them, and also Germany. Why? Because of the Berlin, Moscow, Eurasian axis, deeply damaging. And also why have it? Because then the Americans can keep forces inside Europe. It's all part of that kind of mindset and control. Then we come to the reality of Brexit. And I don't think it's been, and I'm not actually really particularly commented on this to some extent, is yet to be understood, and why the Kabbalists resent such a move in reality. And it's not actually that the UK is leaving the Eurozone. They don't care about that. But once they do, Germany becomes the dominant power from their perspective in Europe, and is hence no longer subjugated by the Kabbalists. Now, what do I mean by that? Well, in essence, the agreement was always to allow the UK to remain outside of the EU in terms of adopting the euro currency, but to remain inside in terms of ensuring that the US has a reliable partner to ensure that Germany remains in tow, i.e. the UK. Now, obviously, the UK departure via Brexit sees an end to that, and it's a crushing defeat for the Kabbalists, not really because Britain leaves the European Union, because yes, it's in it, but also it wasn't in it in the same breath in terms of the euro. But also, this is precisely why Germany's now developing plans for a new European model, along with, as we said, with Finland, Austria, and Holland, and why an EU army is coming about. And no, it's not a Kabbalist army, and it's going to have future Russian integration. Russia's going to become a major partner in terms of a European army, probably with France and Germany in the process. This is coming to pass, and this is precisely why they're terrified of this. So the catalytic effect of Brexit is far greater than Britain, because Britain leaving doesn't make a scrap of difference. The European Union is going to die irrespective, but it's the effect it will have on Germany and how it also will rotate further away from the Kabbalist model of controlling and subjugating Germany within the European Union. Now, not only will all this crushing defeat for the Kabbalists in Europe, it leads to a new European model we've talked about, but stronger economic and military ties with Russia, and why the rotation of Germany east is pivotal to the collapse of the Kabbalists in terms of Europe. Now, for now, UK foreign policy remains very much aligned with Washington, and probably crucially Langley too. But that's not going to remain forever and a day, because there's also going to be changes, and we're already seeing it with respect to China and the UK, because they want to assist in the development of an international market for the yuan. They're competing with the French and the German. The UK might well lose out in that regard, we'll see. But they've got swap agreements with the Chinese, and they've also wanted to be part of the opening of the Chinese domestic bond market to foreign investors. So the UK is very much trying to, in some senses, join forces with China. Bilateral relations with Russia seem miles off, but they're going to come down the track. Probably not. I don't think in the next 6 months or something. Maybe a bit after that, we'll say. But there are other huge failures for the Kabbalists as well. The rotation of Turkey East, a NATO member who's buying air defense S-400s. It'll leave NATO. It will join the Shanghai Cooperation Organization and abandon the current EU model. It's been talking about joining, but it's flirted with it, never really shown any desire, and particularly now it has zero desire. But it will reintegrate with the new European model in the future in a post-Cabal, post-Brussels world. And we're also seeing immense changes that Turkey's even prepared to turn its back on the deep divisions with Iran, which is basically Sunni versus Shia. And Russia is the conduit in that regard, as ever. They're great at building relations with nations and then being the conduit and the glue that gets the likes of Turkey and Iran to work together, to cooperate. And the common enemies become Saudi Arabia, which is going to collapse, as we've said, for a number of years. But once again, it's not an overnight thing. The appointment of Mohammed bin Salman as the crown prince is going to prove to be a disaster. I mean, his naivety with respect to Qatar is staggering, because Saudi, by implication, has seriously damaged its relations with Iran, Turkey and Qatar in the process. And other nations are going to start rotating away. The Egyptians notionally are saying, well, yes, we support the GCC initiative against Qatar. Meanwhile, developing relations with Russia and China in the process. Bahrain's another great example, and the list goes on. And internally, there's huge strife within the House of Saud. And there's also now an uprising by the people who are very sadly being executed for having the temerity to merely protest against their government. What a wonderful nation Saudi is.
Yeah, right.
I mean, it's wonderful. Saudi's trade and budget deficits grow. The war in in Yemen's become the Vietnam, as we've said before. And in terms of Japan and South Korea, whilst the US continues to try and use North Korea as leverage over them, economically they're rotating towards China. So if we look at where we currently are, the US largely has little influence in the world now, except for parts of South America and elements within the Middle East, but with the latter in sharp decline. But it also explains recent events in Venezuela and Brazil. No one's supporting the Venezuelan government, but undoubtedly there is a coup, which is probably Langley back to remove Maduro. Of that, there's no doubt. And in the process, we've seen Russia and China backstopping Venezuela. I mean, this is why, because once again, it all revolves around energy. We know Venezuela's got huge oil reserves, that's no doubt. So where are we currently in light of all this? Well, China is undoubtedly the global economic power, and I use that in a very godly. I don't mean it in a dominant sense, but economically, they're the biggest economy in the world now, without a doubt, despite what anyone says. And the US is very much in terminal decline. So all it has left really is the US dollar, and that is also, as we say, in terminal decline. So what is China and Russia's response to this? This is where we start to answer the whole IMF question in essence. Now, China and Russia and other nations are basically cherry picking the best aspects of Western economic policy, whilst not losing sight of retaining the hierarchical management structure that their governance deploys currently. And China and Russia have not needed this far to take the fight directly to the US dollar effectively. But if necessary, they are prepared to take appropriate action. I think it's unlikely. It would have to be extreme situations for them to really take the war to the US dollar and the heart of the capitalist. But I mean, the Eastern model is quite simple. It's all about a savings-driven economy, which is the route to a successful economy in general. Of course, means an economy built on sound money. So we're kind of going full circle, but we'll go into some detail about what I mean by that. So in essence, you've got gold-backed currencies, gold trade notes, and limiting credit expansion policies. That's sensible economics. And if we look at Russia's economic turnaround in the face of 2014 sanctions to where it is now, it's a remarkable achievement. And all the while, they've accumulated huge quantities of gold in that process. China set up the Shanghai Gold Exchange precisely for the same reasons. And as much as we've said, well, China itself has 40,000 tons, what might really surprise people is that since 2008, China's been on a big policy to tell its people buy gold, hold gold. Chinese population in that period has acquired 15,000 tons of gold.
Wow, that's amazing.
And it also proves that China now must have sufficient reserves for the future economic and financial policy of having a gold-backed yuan to allow this to happen. It's not going to say to the Chinese people, buy all this gold before it holds as much gold as it feels it needs to. And it's also why China and Russia now dominate the gold markets. And China's economic changes just have gone so far under the radar. And it clearly demonstrates, from my perspective, why they're preparing for the new paradigm in earnest. I mean, it's become a declining export market to the US and a shift to the Asian markets. And we're back to that whole thing about sanctions again. The threats against China with regards to sanctions and imposing these tariffs on their goods is just shooting yourself in the head. But China knew this was coming. They knew these trade barriers were anticipated, and why China's already introduced measures to reduce economic dependency on the export of cut-price goods. China's got some challenges which it's been dealing with for quite a few years. There's a shortage of labour that they're filling, and they're moving their economy towards a technology-driven one and the reindustrialization of Eurasia. Because China recognized that alone it couldn't just do it. It needed the other markets, but it's a win when it's not stomping all over Eurasia and via the One Belt, One Road. It's economically beneficial to all nations to participate. Now, as we said, the Trump election, I think, has been this huge catalyst for China to accelerate their plans, no doubt. And we all said that Trump was taking a wrecking ball to the cabal and the deal, or the deep state, however you want to refer to it. I think that's absolutely the case and what has been going on. And in essence, he's done a great job in doing that. I mean, the US was never going to have it easy when you are the reserve currency, when you have had decades of very unfortunate, economic policy and foreign policy in general. But eventually, at some point in the future, yes, the US will change. I can't put any predictions on it at this point. It's something I don't think anybody has a clue about, but let's park that for now. It's something that will be an ongoing development, and we'll see how things unfold in the future. But in terms of this whole economic model, Russia is it's a different kettle of fish in some senses, because it's resource rich and reliant, albeit less so now than it was maybe even 2 years ago, on its energy markets. And together with Iran, which is why I've always factored Iran into this Berlin, Beijing, Tehran kind of axis, Moscow included, of course. They, together with Iran, Russia's taking the challenge to the dollar with the oil markets, and it will use oil as a potent weapon, which will inflict huge damage indirectly. Once again, it's not a direct challenge, it's an indirect challenge. And this is why China's moves with Saudi Arabia and the acceptance of the yuan as the currency of trade in terms of old contracts with the kingdom is clear, and the strategy is clear why they're doing it. It's also why Iran and Russia probably are the two most demonized nations on the planet at this time, because the capitalists are starting to go, okay, we kind of see what they're doing. They're going to use oil as a weapon against us. It's precisely why China and Russia have the 40,000 tons of gold or thereabout, which insulates their currencies against future economic and therefore currency shocks going forward. I mean, after all, sound money and wealth creation remains at the heart of everything both of these nations have been doing for the last, it's difficult to say, certainly pre-2008. I mean, Russia's had far more challenges economically, but the storm it weathered, sanctions, turned it on its head and made the Russian economy even stronger. There's not many nations in the world that could do that, and in the process, use trade surpluses to buy up more gold. But it's precisely why we'll see the adoption of a gold standard. China can manage their credit explosion, as we said, and are doing so. But the People's Bank of China, their central bank, which will have money backed by gold, will be a devastating blow for the capitalists. China could announce at any point in time, I'm not seeing this imminently, their true gold holding and their intention to back their currency with gold. Russia will follow suit, and I've understood for quite a long time that will happen simultaneously. Now, the question here is, they have to be careful how they manage this. Go on. I think you're going to chip in, so far away.
No, very, very interesting. I was going to allow you to continue because you might be going in that direction. So please continue.
Okay, right. So the question there is, as ever, they don't want to be seen to be the nations that destroy the dollar. Now, when they kind of make these announcements, I don't think the West's going to particularly pay much attention. Well, people like us and listen to the show go, oh wow, there's a big benchmark change in this event-driven scenario. It's a chance of the Western nation will go, well, who cares? I think they'll keep it within their internal markets initially. They can implement bond markets that are going to be highly advantageous to their people, and they'll keep it internalized. And ultimately, they'll extend it to foreign investors. I don't think there's any doubt. I mean, ultimately, the outcome's obvious. You'll have a demand for physical metal. Well, at some point, when the realization hits the West smack between the eyes, there'll be a surge in West. The paper markets will implode. And China, as I say, going to manage this process internally. So the West is in essence largely clueless about what's going on. But they'll create sound yuan and ruble currencies internally, and then no one can blame them for the collapse of the US dollar. The internationalization comes later. But this in turn eventually will see the end of the US dollar and the birth of economies no longer burdened by fiat currency and central bank dominance. And I have to be careful because everyone always thinks every central bank in the world's a problem. The Russian central bank has been incredibly supportive, and its policies have been absolutely incredibly on the spot in terms of managing the Russian economy. And this knocks all these ideas, which you've had for years, that the Rothschilds control the Russian central bank. Absolutely no, they don't. And believe it or not, the idea that the Rothschilds control all these central banks is a bit of an illusion as well. It's not them who control the central bank. It's far more complicated than that. But yes, the capitalists have controlled central banks, that's true. But they don't control the Russian central bank at all. And Russian policy has been, I think hats off to them. They've done incredibly well to turn their economy around in the face of sanctions and every other measure to try and render their country economically bankrupt effectively. So in essence, that's where we're kind of at. So we're at the point now where everything's about the death of the dollar. It's a gradual process. There's going to be a whole bunch of event-driven scenarios where things will come to pass in the future going forward. Nations will start to move away from using the dollar. Nations will rotate politically. They'll rotate economically away from US and Germany, as you'll see in Europe, as we're seeing in the Middle East. I mean, the Middle East is a great example. It's not just what's happened in Syria and Iraq. It's how Iran's working with Iraq. It's how Turkey's working with Iran. It's how the attempt to stifle Qatar is failing. I mean, and because perversely the Saudis genuinely probably thought that the US were going to assist them in that regard, the US has got no intention. And this is where the Tillerson angle is absolutely critical, because there are the war-hungry elements within the US administration and inside the intelligence agencies who are desperately see war as the only option. And Tillerson's doing a very good job to try and prevent that happening. And that's why he's so pivotal to the future of the US in terms of its foreign policy. And ultimately, its foreign policy is going to either be a positive angle for them in the future or be very detrimental and blow up in their face if they persist in doing insane, stupid things which are highly detrimental to the US in the process. But this is why everything that happens in the world is important. The focus, with all due respect to the US, as big a nation as it is and has been historically, the focus isn't just what's going on in the US. Yes, there are important developments, and we'll talk in future weeks about things in the US, and we've covered a lot of in podcasts with regards to what's going on in the US because it's pivotally important. But we have to take this 10,000 foot view, as we have done today, to try and say, okay, this is what's happened. This is where we are currently in these. And going forward, these are the changes you're going to see. You're going to start to see more economic changes. You're going to see nations start to rotate their economies. You're going to see nations buying up more and more gold and silver, for that matter, in the process, and having asset-backed currencies. You'll start to see these changes. The Middle East's a huge playground currently, so's Europe. And in the process, you're seeing the gradual neutering of the US dollar as a weapon of mass destruction. And that's what it has been. There's no other way. I mean, for all the wars that have been fought, that has probably been the most potent weapon that the capitalists have ever had, because it's allowed them as well, ironically, of course, to finance and fight all these wars.
Correct. Very, very interesting. Now, in terms of the U.S. dollar, globally, Paul, when you take a look at the treasuries that are out there, I mean, obviously, U.S. holdings of treasuries by other countries is pretty significant. So, in the event of a dollar collapse, a world currency shift, is that potentially why this is being dragged out? I mean, that you're talking about significant holdings with several countries that would greatly affect if the U.S. dollar is not allowed a slow, gradual pullback.
I think the reality is the US Treasury figures for nations are largely an illusion. Nations have been dumping dollars a hell of a lot more, and that's why than people realize, and that's why we've seen all these strange accounts whereby nations like Belgium and countries like that, and we've seen it with the Cayman Islands and various others, where they've had these inordinately huge treasury holdings, which makes absolutely no sense. And there's been a lot of jiggery pokery with regards to moving that around. Also, a lot of US dollars have come home and have been absorbed by the exchange stabilization fund, which is hiding a lot of dark US dollars effectively in the process. So there's a lot of this going on. I don't think the holdings in the world is anywhere near to the extent. I don't believe China holds what it does, or Russia's considerably less so, but China's a great example. Japan's another one. I just don't believe they have the holding. I mean, ultimately, you do make a point. If you sink the dollar, then the risk is, of course, in the process, you're going to lose, trillions or a trillion US treasuries, effectively. But the reality is, this is why they're already rotating their economies, buying up huge amounts of gold, buying up assets and dumping dollars. If you factor in all the assets that are being bought and all the money's effectively being spent, you can't equate it all to the amount of US treasuries that nations are supposed to hold is a reality. Yeah, there's Western nations undoubtedly hold it, and they're going to pay a price in the future as and when the so-called reset happens in the future, whatever point in time. But the reality is, I don't hold much weight in the figures that publish, and the exchange stabilization fund, which is a bit of a dangerous thing to talk about, but who cares anymore? We need to understand what is their role in terms of US treasuries and where they've ended up, and have they been buying up and taking them off book effectively? I think very much that's been happening, and that's a way to disguise to the world the weakness of the US dollar and how US de-dollarization is happening, because as far as most people are concerned, it's a non-event, and it's never going to become a problem. And the US dollar is the dominant currency, and that's the way it's always going to be. And yeah, China and Russia maybe China, not even Russia, are just nibbling at the edges, and they're not going to make any difference. That's the perspective. I think when that illusion's shattered, then that is a huge turning point. But we're not at that point where a lot of people see that as a problem. It's why also, we're also seeing ridiculous US economic stats that don't bear why the Dow's at 22,000 recently and likely to go a lot higher. This is all kind of just nonsense. It's a way of disguising. The higher it goes, we said before, is a clear indication that the cabal are losing control in the process. So if it goes to 30,000, that's another great indicator. It's not an indicator of any strength. All the US economic metrics prove that the US is effectively an economic third world nation. However people like it, it's not a nice thing to say, but it's a reality. You've got 20 trillion in debt. You've got 200, 300 trillion in unfunded liabilities. And you've got an economy that is, you've got 50 million people on food stamps, 100 million people roughly, who are what they say, what's the term? Sorry, brain's gone temporarily. They're economically inactive, I guess is the best way of describing it, which basically
Correct.
probably means they're unemployed effectively. So, there's nothing great about the US economy, and I'm not just picking on the US. The UK economy is weak. Western economies are weak. That is a reality. I mean, everybody knows that. But unfortunately, our focus tends to come back to the US because it holds the world's reserve currency, and therefore it is a focal point to a large extent, but it's not unique in terms of its problems.
Correct. So in the event a the gold standard, what does that do domestically for the U.S. dollar in the event that we maintained in the States what do you anticipate as far as a devaluation of the dollar, and how does that affect domestically in the United States?
Well, obviously, a devalued dollar means that, I mean, from an export perspective, it means the US can have very cheap exports. It's a great in that regard, and it will help the US take the necessary step to reinvigorate its economy and become stronger on a world stage again in amongst equals. The only problem is imports become hellishly expensive. I mean, you're going to have hyperinflationary problems with the US. And of course, the US is so dependent on other nations because it's had so much deindustrialization since the late 90s, really. Another great Clinton. Let's export all our industrial base to China. Well, the reason they did it is because it was cheaper to manufacture things in China. So the capitalists, corporations could make bigger profits, but in the process, they deeply damaged the US economy. And, the problem we've seen, as much as Trump wants to have a huge infrastructure build, and as much as there's all these idea of tax reform and healthcare reforms and all that, the reason none of it's coming to pass is because China is the US's biggest creditor, and China's rejecting the US dollar, and the US has no one to borrow money from, or to acquire the means to bring about all these policies. That's the ultimate damning indictment of the US dollar. It's that rejection which is stymieing the US's ability to introduce any new fiscal policy, economic policies. It just isn't possible to do it. Why they're stymied, and why things aren't going anywhere in the process? Because how are the US going to finance what they need to? Yeah, they probably need at least $1 trillion for infrastructure, which probably means a $1.5 trillion or $2 trillion. They're not in the position to be able to finance that. It's as simple as that, and that's why it has largely gone quiet. We just don't hear it talked about much because economic reality is hitting home. Another reason why you don't go and upset the Chinese in the process. They're your biggest creditor. I mean, if you and I had someone that we were a credit to, we're not going to start annoying them to the point that they might take some action that is highly detrimental to us in the process. So, and of course, the Chinese have had this policy. They have dumped dollars, and then they'll buy assets up, and then they'll take stock and sit back and go, okay, well, we bought some assets. What are we going to do? Okay, and people go, oh, they're restricting capital outflows. They're not allowing. No, that's not what they do. It's not because of the Chinese economy. It's because they sensibly take stock of what assets are being bought, what they're doing. Okay, and that's why you see little spurts of buying assets. And of course, yes, the US are now trying to stop that and say to the Chinese, well, we're not going to allow you to buy assets anymore in the same place. But the Chinese buying US assets, I can see the problems. I can see why people are concerned about it. But in a way, the Chinese are able to help reindustrialize the US. And I've personally known of examples where they've bought ailing factories or factories that are basically on the verge of collapse. They've financed it, rebuilt it. Not only have they kept existing staff on, but they've employed, doubled workforce, added 20, 30, 50, 60% more people. People are happy working there. They get treated well. They get paid well. The working conditions are fine. Yes, there is Chinese involvement, but it's not like they're turning it into all these fearful sweatshops that everyone thinks the Chinese are going to do to the US. It's an important lesson that the US can learn, but equally they don't want the Chinese just buying up assets. That there are certain things it wouldn't be it's ill-advised for the US to trade in on, but there are certain opportunities where Chinese investment will be a good thing into the US economy, and the rest of the world's recognizing it, including the Russians and everybody else. So at some point the US is going to have to also recognize that that's a viable option, and they have to take things on individual merits, of course, but it's the way forward, and it has to be the way forward. Well, from my perspective, anyway.
Right. Well, Paul, great job, recapping, going through that. I want to afford you the time. So if you want to continue, or if you want to talk about what you envision here in the future, or recap, I yield the floor to you, whatever direction you'd like to go, sir.
Well, we could do it, but yeah, I'm quite happy to. I mean, is there anything in this context, maybe something you've thought about while we've talked, or is anyone who's kind of, I know obviously in the YouTube kind of chat room has asked anything or made any observations? I'm not obviously looking at it, but maybe there's something we could address in that regard, or, but I think in a broad sense, we're kind of where we are now is we're seeing all these huge geopolitical changes which are coming about for all the reasons discussed, and that will continue. And in the process, of course, the US loses its kind of global status as for want of a better word, a superpower in the process. But the long-term prognosis for the US I feel is good, because I think there's the backbone of America wants to make America a great nation amongst equals again. The Rust Belt is a great example. I think they'll roll up their sleeves and will reindustrialize and make America a strong nation amongst equal. US foreign policy will eventually change when the the neocons, the neo-hawks and all their ilk eventually cease to have any influence, which is going to happen. And maybe it's a good point to say there's a lot of frustration, I think, with everybody at not seeing this whole idea of mass arrests. Mass arrest is never going to happen. We've said it, well, I've said it for probably 2 or 3 years. Yes, that you will see the end of dynasties within the cabal, but you're not going to have this idea that 50 people got arrested today and they're all going to be indicted on charges. You will eventually see the end of the Clinton empire and their ilk. I think that is an inevitability. It's not going to happen quite how people think it is or when people think it will happen, but it will come about. You'll see the end of all the other dynasties that, for me, are being hugely detrimental to the US and the world at large. And some of them people have never heard of, and some of them obviously are very prominent in people's thought processes. But this is going to come about, but it's how do you make this come about, and how do you make it so there's kind of limited collateral damage in the process of doing it. But the problem you have in the US, and we know this, is the fact that on the one side, you have Trump, who's trying to drain, as he always said, drain the swamp, although I'm now referring to it as draining the cesspit, because I think it's more of a cesspit than the swamp. You've got those who are determined for him not to do this. So you've got the kind of special counsel, which is all the Russian investigation focus, which is trying to distract people from focusing on the real problems in terms of the US administration and where fault and culpability really lies. But there are attempts to address that, but it's a long process, and this is why I keep saying things don't happen in 5 minutes, 5 weeks, 5 months. All these people going, oh, this is going to happen on this date. It's not date driven. It never has been, but the progress is immense. The US has huge challenges, and internally, as we know, externally in terms of its foreign policy, how the world perceives it. But even in spite of the latest sanctions against Russia, which ultimately are hugely damaging, you know what? You have to reflect that Lavrov and Moscow are going, do you know what? We still believe we can get over all this, bullshit, and I'll use that word because that's what it is. And we can readdress these problems and get everything on an even footing and work together for future progress. Because you know what? Lavrov knows that's what Tillerson wants to happen, and knows that that's what the US people want to happen in the May, and realize that it doesn't reflect the US as a nation when you have a bunch of lunatics who've ruled the US covertly for decades and beyond. But there is a recognition also that that Russia has to protect its own interest. Europe has to protect its own interest. It's not going to allow its economies to be wrecked by the US in the process, and Tillerson's aware of this. Lavrov's aware of it, and they're doing all they can to address those problems. But even Tillerson acknowledges, why should these nations accept that? Why should they allow their nations to be destroyed by insane US, policies, in this case with regards to sanctions? So you also have to factor that. So I think it's very difficult to always know exactly what's going on in the US. There's so much, information in the alternative media, and frankly, a lot of it's not reality. It's difficult. This is why I've tried to start a piece. People have asked me about McMaster in terms of what's the reality of what he's doing. Well, on face value, it seems pretty obvious, but I'm still trying to delve into that, look into that, to try and give a considered response that I feel backs up the assertion that he's being deeply destructive to US foreign policy, particularly, and everything points to that. But then I've heard old people saying, well, actually, it's not as clear as it may seem, and then it's trying to understand the reality of what's going on. And that's all we can do, is to try and understand things in clear, unequivocal terms as to what exactly is going on. But the US is very complicated at the moment. It's not a simple question of, 1 + 1 = 2. It's far more complicated than that. But there's no doubt the Trump administration is still trying to regain control. It's kind of this war of attritional wrestling match between the Washington machinery and the Trump administration. What I think's interesting is that we're seeing more and more military style appointments. Now, some people argue some of those are not good. I think some of them are going to bear fruit in the future, which may be, positive impact and outcome for the US. The important thing is to try and, in the one sense, take the wrecking ball to the cabal, which is Trump's job. It's very difficult in the same breath to try and, economically salvage things for the US, but at some point, work will begin in earnest, and everybody in the US is going to have to work very hard, as is everyone in the UK and everywhere. And we've said this before, to rebuild nations in a post-cabal world. The rest of the world's already moved on and is doing that, hence One Belt, One Road and everything else, which we've covered off today. And they're important distinctions. But yes, the future will eventually be bright, but I think it will take a number of years. But it's not a static or staccato process where nothing happens and then, wow, this has happened. Things are going on all the time. There are key things that will come to fruition. Eventually, Saudi will completely rotate. It will dump the US petrodollar, big change. But Saudi itself is precariously likely to collapse. That could have a serious impact in the region. You've also got nations like Japan rotating towards China, as it should do. Germany is another great example. These are kind of pivotal moments, but 100, 1,000 things have to happen to make these things happen. And when people go, well, why is Germany's vehemently opposed to sanctions against Russia, but they're also talking about putting sanctions on Russia over the whole Siemens issue with Crimea and supplying turbines to Crimea. That shows how complicated it is. Not a question of having a very simplistic approach and saying, well, everything must mean this, so therefore going forward it means that. It's a very complicated world intermeshed with a cabal who have had their fingers in every pie to unbelievable depths to control things, to deep, compartmentalize things, and by design, and that makes it a very hard challenge to deal with it. And the US is a great example where you've got people like Tillerson on the one side who fully sees the picture, and the Trump administration tries to integrate and bring more people into the fold to try and foment a plan which will work for the US. And then you've got other people who are fighting to preserve the unipolar world without actually realizing it has no basis and no one takes it seriously outside the US anymore. And why? And they still believe that the US holds center stage and they haven't lost all these allies in the process, whereas the US's position is weakening. And yes, they are going to still interfere. And there's no doubt for me, the CIA is interfering in Venezuela. I think it's been interfering in Brazil. South America is probably one aspect it still thinks it can maintain some control over, but pretty much everywhere else in the world, its influence is waning really significantly, and that's inevitable. But it's also the mindset. There's a lot of people inside the Congress and the Senate who still just don't get what's happening. They still believe that the US is the strong, dominant nation, and they refuse to accept reality, even when it's presented to them in very clear terms. It's quite staggering. I mean, I became aware of comments that was made by someone inside the Senate who made comments regarding that China's this backward third world economic nation and Russia's like almost, in the dark ages still. They have no concept of reality as to what is really going on, even though it should be pretty obvious if they, like everyone who listens to, Rogue Money and beyond, who takes an interest in global geopolitics, realizes that that's not the truth. But that's the other problem, because people don't see the reality. So it's very hard to get people inside the Senate, inside and elsewhere, to actually believe the reality of what's going on. That's a huge kind of paradigm shift in mentality that takes time for people to realize. And very sadly, they may not realize until the point of no return, when rather like 2008, there was no way anyone could hide from the reality, but the reality was building up from 2006, kind of mid onwards, that 2008 was an inevitability. But these people didn't see it because they just constantly believe that the US is supreme, the US dollar reigns, and it will always will do ad infinitum.
Right. Well, and in part, that's why we have built the largest military. And so, Paul, in terms of the amount of uncertainty over the witness, we witnessed the UN pass new sanction against North Korea. China signed up for it. Russia, the UN Security Council. Could that potentially be the military escalation that the I'm going to call them the deep state want, because they understand what is happening globally with the dollar?
Well, yeah, I think there's no doubt they're beginning to see the bigger picture. They tried it in the Middle East and failed. They, they've moved on to North Korea, and they're not really getting much traction. I mean, yeah, Russia and China signed up, and people will be a bit surprised, but yeah, North Korea is a problem. It's just not the problem the way not the US administration, well, yes, partly the US administration may not. Yes, they do have the potential to launch a weapon that could land in South Korea, which could set off a whole chain reaction. It's so it is a problem, and I do support China and Russia's viewpoint that imposing the sanctions is a necessity to try and curb North Korea. But it's more symbolic. I mean, we've got this, and then on the flip side, Russia and China are carrying on negotiations with the North Korea to come to some sort of sensible mediation of the problems in the region. But again, the problem is that historically, North Korea is CIA backed. There are elements within North Korea who want an end to the nonsense and want unification with South Korea and normalization of relations with Japan, China, Russia, and everyone else, the US and everyone else for that matter. And then you've got the hardcore lunatic fringe who just want to keep setting off missiles in. So it's not that simple. So I think it is largely a symbolic gesture. It's not the Chinese and the Russians saying to the US, "Well, we're giving you the carte blanche now. You can go and start launching missiles in the region and set off a huge war in the process in the Korean Peninsula for all the reasons we know and understand." So no, I don't see it to be that. But I think in a way it's a gesture to the North Koreans to say, look, enough's enough. You have to, and they have been quite clear to the North Koreans, stop launching missiles, stop being provocative. But equally, they've said to the South Koreans and the US, stop bringing in more, anti-missile systems into the country. Stop building up more forces and putting military bases and more US troops. It's both sides need to lower the rhetoric, lower the tone, and diffuse the problem, not antagonize the problem. And it is kind of rather childish. It's kind of childish in a very dangerous way when nations play these kind of stupid games of, well, you did this, so we're going to do that, and well, you did that, so we're going to do this. But that's effectively what's going on. But everything's about mediation and preventing war and preventing an escalation of conflict in the region. That's ultimately the Chinese and the Russian aim. And as much as they'll support those sanctions, they've also previously said to the US, if you start launching preemptive strikes, your entire US fleet will be at the bottom of the ocean, and we're not. That's not a threat. That's a promise. We will do it. And the US has largely backed off. Oh yeah, there's the war neocon hawks who are desperate to keep. But basically, the US administration and Tillerson particularly knows full well war's insanity, and it will solve nothing. It will only be extremely damaging to the US in the process. So.
Right,
It
right.
is once
And Paul,
again,
if you have,
yeah.
no, I was gonna say,
Sorry,
and
go
if
on.
you have time, I have one more question for you, and it's kind of
Yeah,
twofold.
please.
No,
That's
just in
fine.
part.
No, it's fine. Go on. It's fine. It's no problem.
Well, the first part of the question is, I know you've mentioned a couple of times in regards to Saudi Arabia, and the collapse of Saudi Arabia. So my first part of it is that, number one, will that be an internal collapse? And then the second part of that question is, we know that Syria was about the gas lines. We know that Yemen is about the Saudi concern regarding the gas, the oil, the minerals in Yemen. So, in part with Yemen, is that how much longer can the U.S. or will the U.S. continue to allow Saudi Arabia to engage with this type of behavior? I mean, it's just very concerning, and I'm just thinking that potentially could be the I don't want to use the catalyst or the trigger, but in terms of the influence it has. So, could you speak briefly about that?
Yeah, well, in terms of I mean, it's it's kind of an internal collapse of Saudi Arabia. I mean, it's going to be. I mean, the House of Saud is likely to capitulate completely. There'll be economic capitulation. I mean, there's things in process with oil, and there's this big thing regarding oil being, around the $50 mark, and the necessity to preserve that psychologically speaking. But there are moves in the oil market. I've always been a long-term advocate of oil's going to go to $20 a barrel again at some point. I still believe that will happen. That will economically cripple nations like Saudi Arabia. So it's multifaceted there in terms of, but the Saudi collapse can also be as a result of the war in Yemen, because I mean, economically, it's very damaging to them. It's very. I mean, I'm not trying to, in any way, deflect away from the humanitarian crisis and the death of anybody, and that includes Saudi, personnel who are fighting a war because they're forced. Military forces have to go and fight wars. It doesn't mean they agree with it. So I'm not, but economically, it's very expensive for Saudi, and the question is how much longer can they continue doing it, because they're not making the grounds and inroads they want to. It is a Vietnam, and we know what happened to the US in Vietnam. They eventually walked out of a very, very costly war and never made any ground whatsoever and in terms of what their intended, target and progress was.
Right.
It's exactly the same in Saudi, but that's equally another economically damaging war. But what do the Saudis do? It's very difficult. It's like Qatar. I mean, they're economically weak. We're starting to see backlash internally. I mean, but it's not like you and I could protest in the US and the UK about governments. If you do that in Saudi, and it's normally met with very severe retribution. And we have already heard, well, I've certainly heard of people being executed for what they perceive as coups to overthrow the House of Saudi. It's not that at all, but that's the level of fear.
I
Undoubtedly,
think I think they're tearing down whole villages now, Paul, in the South.
yes, yeah, I mean, exactly. It's pretty nasty stuff that's going on, and unsurprisingly, in the process. But so this is why the fear from the House of Saudi, the collapse of Saudi Arabia is, and if the House of Saud goes, who fills the vacuum? That's a bit of a serious problem, because there is no doubt there is Al Qaeda Daesh influences inside Saudi. The risk is, imagine if they take control of the Saudi kingdom. That, I'm not saying it'll happen, but the risk of that is well, we know what would be catastrophic. I mean, in some ways, it's better the devil you know than the devil you don't. And I don't want the House of Saud to be in Saudi Arabia, but equally, we don't want Al Qaeda and or Daesh controlling Saudi Arabia, and they've already made noises about seeking to take control of it. I mean, that might be all just, bluster and hyperbole, but we still have to take it, seriously in the context of what's going on. So most definitely, Saudi Arabia is on a political knife edge. It's on an economic knife edge. Now, this is why, negotiations with China over dumping the petrodollar and adopting the yuan is very critical. It's also why Saudi is in negotiations, and we keep seeing this. And people say to me, "Well, why is Russia and China in negotiations with a state like Saudi? What the hell are they playing at? Why are they supporting it?" No, they're not supporting. This isn't supporting regimes. They don't care about the politics of a nation. It's about business. It's about economic, and it's about their future view of how Saudi should be, and adopting these relations might be able to smooth the transition process. It's in the future, probably not in the short term, but it's a very difficult, complex situation. But Saudi Arabia is key to the catalyst. When Saudi falls or Saudi dumps the petrodollar, then that is a huge game-changing moment. Of that, there is no doubt. And but in the process, the Saudi economy is extremely weak, and the war but what do? If they walk away from the war in Yemen? Internally, it makes them look very politically weak. If they walk away from Qatar, even though I think probably privately they want to walk away, but they can't, it makes them look very weak. So they're very vulnerable by their very actions, because often nations, when they're internally very weak or vulnerable, they'll try and go and puff their chest out on a world stage. Hence, going into Yemen. Hence, the Qatari thing was to try give the impression that Saudi has some clout in the Middle East, and to a large extent, of course, it no longer does. And also, it is in the process of rotating away from the US, and in essence, the whole sort of Mohammed bin Salman, who became the crown prince, is more to do where he's supposed to be viewed as not, something that a US style appointment, where Nayef was kind of more how the US want to see things. And people see this as a rotation away from Washington. And to some extent, it's true. But the Saudis also, in the flip side, and this is elements are still dependent on the US and want the US support, as they have done, and which was a prerequisite for the adoption of the petrodollar. The US would defend the Saudis. But there are elements within the Saudi regime who don't want this anymore. So once again, it's another nation that's deeply divided and has a kind of cabal type supporting people. You have those vehemently against it and those who are swinging in the middle between which side they think might win at the end of the day. So it makes it politically internally a very, very divisive and weak nation as well. But I think undoubtedly, at some point they're going to have to pull out of Yemen, or it's going to be the end of the war. But in the process, the humanitarian crisis is, is just appalling. And what we
Yeah, it
have to
is.
mention is,
It is.
people are talking about cholera like, oh, it's some kind of cabal. They've introduced this, the cholera virus and to kill people. No, it's not. It's what happens when you have wars, when you have, a lack of sanitation. I'm sorry to burst people's bubble on the conspiracy side. It's what happens in nations when they just have total lack of sanitation. Unfortunately, these kind of diseases spread very rapidly, and of course, they have a devastating effect on populations. So no, it's not some germ warfare from the cabal to try and kill the Yemenis people. Absolutely not the case. But it doesn't detract from the fact it's a huge humanitarian crisis. And at some point, the world's going to have to turn around and say enough's enough. But is that in the order of things in terms of what needs to be done? Yes, it should be the highest priority, any humanitarian crisis, but unfortunately, it probably isn't. And there are far more bigger problems from in a broader perspective in terms of dealing with problems in the Middle East. And it always comes back to the point that any loss of life is hugely regrettable. But in the end, if you have to make policy decisions that saves millions of lives, eventually that would be lost, as opposed to 100,000 or a million, then those decisions get made. It's not a very nice to kind of have this mathematical equation as to how you do things, but at some point you have to factor that into realities that that's how unstable things are. I mean, the Russians knew full well that their military involvement in Syria was going to result in the death of people. I mean, it was inevitable, but in the end, the end has justified the means to remove the scourge of Daesh, Al Qaeda, whatever you want to call it, out of Syria, for example, and that war is progressing more and more to a resolution. The same that happened in Iraq. Sometimes you have to fight these very ugly battles to remove a long-standing problem, because if they hadn't and Syria had fallen, the consequences would have been catastrophic for all the Syrian people.
Correct.
Of that, there is no doubt. So I'm not trying to, and I don't. I'm the last person on this planet who likes to see wars happen. But sometimes wars have to happen by necessity for good reasons, and it's hugely regrettable. And I think undoubtedly there are wars still to be fought, or battles still to be fought, where there will be loss of life. But in certain very hot, politically hot, spots in the world, and we're still in that process. As we've said, the war's over from with the cabal, but the battles will continue, and there will still be battles, as and to use the phrase that the Nazis, for me, lost the war, World War II, when they invaded Russia. But until the armistice was signed and war was ended, there were still people dying. And in fact, people were dying even days after, because they didn't realize the war had ended. And that's the kind of where we're at now. Wars don't just sort of stop, and they go on for a long time, but the cabal are defeated. But it's rather like the Nazis. It takes a number of years. And sadly, in the process, many people lost their lives in the process. But that's where we're at. And if we could wave a magic wand and stop it all tomorrow and prevent all this, then anyone would want to do that. But it's never that simple. And we always have to be mindful that, this is a war to take control of our planet again from people who had total disregard for every last person on this planet. And it's that big a job. And I think it's been managed pretty well in to a large extent, particularly kind of in the Far East. I mean, to a large extent, the Middle East has been managed pretty well. And yes, it hasn't been a complete success. Europe's not really a military battleground; it's an economic battleground. But that I think is slowly but surely being addressed. I mean, internally, I don't know what's going to happen in nations when the hammer falls, so to speak. I mean, the US, it's very difficult to ascertain how things will play out in the short term, but I think the long-term prognosis will be fine. But once a nation has its freedom, it's up to the people to grasp that and rebuild a nation for future generations. I mean, it's not about the here and now. It's about building a lasting legacy that generations in the future will look back and thank the American people of this time for all the work they did to liberate their nation and make it a truly strong, great nation again. And I want that as much as anybody. I mean, I've got a lot, people like yourself, friends, people I work with, people I've known for years. We've got a lot of friends, Lisa and I, we know, and we want the US to be a great nation again. And we are concerned about its short-term future. And we hope that, a lot of problems can be mitigated. But in the end, we can look back in the future and go, the US is the fantastic nation again. And it will work side by side with Russia and China. And when there are global problems that need addressing, which hopefully there won't be that many, but there will still be, I think terrorism is a risk for the foreseeable future. They will work together to eradicate it immediately and not allow it to escalate. And that's the big advantage when the US does the things the US is great at doing, and it works with these nations, then it will become a really, truly great nation amongst equals, and the world will turn around and go, yeah, that's the US we always wanted to see, and not the US that was hijacked, as we've seen, and has decimated US in terms of its foreign policy and all the things it shouldn't have done, and in the process has decimated the US economy internally because it knew of no other way to preserve its own existence, even though ultimately, of course, it's futile and its economic and policies have been completely and utterly have failed the American people. And it's not by design. They didn't do this. But they didn't see any other route to preserve their empire. But the truth is they never had to do that. They could have had an element of use control loosely, but they could have made America a strong nation. They could have benefited from it economically, but it could have made it a great nation for the US and worked with nations around the world in the process to make everyone great and be a win-win for everyone. But that, of course, was never their intention, as we know.
Right, correct. Paul, thank you so much. It's been a great broadcast. I really appreciate all your information. Great intelligence report. Share with our listeners, just in case they don't know, why don't you share your website, your information, so we can continue supporting yourself and your work, Paul?
Well, thank you. And first off, thanks to everyone at Rogue Money for all the support they've provided us and the exposure they've given us. We very much appreciate it. I mean, obviously the website's thesiriusreport.com. That's SIRIUS. Obviously there's a lot of free content on there. We also, yes, we have the premium podcast, which is $4.75 a month. We think it's great value. We provide a lot of information. You get 5 podcasts equivalent a week, with a lot of highly detailed information that we don't discuss elsewhere. We don't put it out on shows like this or in the written medium. And we thank everyone who has subscribed. Obviously, we'd like more people to subscribe and support our work because it allows us to be able to do more in the process of developing what we're trying to do. It's the same for everyone in our position. And that's under the premium content section on the website. Obviously, we have the Twitter page at the Sirius Report. We have a Facebook page. We've kind of trying to get rid of the group having problems doing that, but it's not functional anymore. And you can respond to comments, and if there's things you'd like us to comment on or discuss on that, you can always email us in the process. You can email us the serioussreport@gmail.com, and we welcome all feedback and any observations people want to make in the process. And I think probably I've said enough in terms of promoting what we do, but we thank everyone who has does support us because and also we thank Rogue Money particularly because they've really kind of moved us onto a different level because of the exposure we've got, and and they don't profit from anything we do. They're just very supportive, and we very much appreciate that.
And it's our honor and privilege, Paul. So with that, thank you everyone for listening in. This is CJ and London Paul delivering another Sirius report, and we're over and out.